Thank you, Heidi. Bruce, welcome. For those of you that don't know Bruce, Bunurong Ewan man with connections to Tasmania, a writer with an extraordinary history, and we're incredibly pleased and privileged to have you with us today. And not only because of his contribution, but tomorrow is the 50th anniversary of the 1967 referendum. 50 years ago tomorrow, Australia decided that they would shift the landscape around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs, that they would create a whole new narrative about this area of our life. And it's only, I think, right that Bruce joins us today because the work that he's produced, and particularly Dark Emu amongst others, shifts the narrative about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and awakens us to the reality of our people's lives and contributions in this country and to this country over many, many decades. You know, late last year I was fortunate to be on country with people in Kakadu, and two old people, Mark and May, took me to a site that they look after. And they showed me this site that had just recently been excavated, and it had dated human occupation at that site at 62,000 years. And they just simply said to me, and I reckon the more you dig, the older it'll get. And I reckon they're going to be right. But tomorrow is that important anniversary about where we shifted the narrative about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australian identity and in Australian life. And the work of Bruce and others like Bruce helps us again shift that dynamic and create a whole new narrative which can just be so important for the image and the vision we create for where we want to go as a nation, for where we want to go as individuals, and where we want to go as people. So I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to hear from Bruce and to enrich my vision about where we as an institution can take these early steps that we've taken around Wingaramura and strengthen them so that our contribution to the narrative is as impactful, is as exciting, and possesses as much potential as the sort of contributions that the 67 referendum made, that Bruce has made, and that I think that students and staff at this university can make. Can you please welcome Bruce Kraska?
Thank you very much for that welcome, and I'm very pleased to be standing on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. What I'm wanting to talk to you about is one of the greatest miscarriages of education the world has ever seen, in that the relationship Australia has with Aboriginal people is based on a colonial lie. By the time Europeans arrived in Australia, colonialism was refined to its sharpest point. Land had been taken from Indigenous peoples on almost every continent by Europeans, and to discuss the mindset of Europeans at that period of history is a study in itself, and that study has rarely been done, especially by Indigenous people. And to study the European mind from the point of view of dispossessed Indigenous people will be a very, very valuable insight into human psychology. This presentation is called The World's First Baker. The first slide is Mount Gungra. It's not just a pretty picture, they're the eggs of the rainbow serpent, and the story of the rainbow serpent that comes from Cape York right down to the Australian Alps, over to South Australia, and then to Western Australia, where the serpent's head rests on Rottnest Island, is not just a kid's story about snakes and ladders. It is at the heart of understanding the nation. And to do that, you have to appreciate Aboriginal law. We've rarely done that in this country. We've skated on the surface of it because in order for a Christian nation to take the land of an existing civilisation, some very powerful and well-organised lies had to be committed. When I went to school, which was quite a long time ago, as you can guess, I was told as an Aboriginal boy that Aboriginal people had been on the continent for 5,000 years. By the time I got to secondary school, that was 15,000 years. By the time I got to university, it was 40,000 years. Nobody bothered to tell me that the age of 40,000 years is reached by the time that all carbon is exhausted from, say, a boomerang or a stone tool. So it's not a real date. It's as far as those dating methods can go. Now that we have more sophisticated dating methods, we come up with ages like 62,000 years. At Warrnambool, earlier in this year, an investigation of an old midden was undertaken, and the dates for that midden are 60 to 80,000 years. 80,000 years is 10,000 years before out of Africa. Got no idea how Aboriginal people arrived here before people left Africa. A mathematical problem worth querying and putting through a Google search. But most of our archaeological graduates go to Egypt to study the pyramids that need another study like Hamlet needs another review. And we persist in refusing to look at the heritage in this country simply because we cannot afford to admit what we've done in the country. Now, I had the same education as every other Australian of my era, and right up to the education that my daughter and my son had and that my grandson is now having. And the whole idea about Aboriginal occupation of the soil was that Aboriginal people were mere hunters and gatherers. There's probably an on switch here. Sorry. Yeah, on the side. Why would you look there? And the explanation that Christians had to explain what they had done was often put into art, Christian art. And this one was taken recently in Brisbane. I used to see these all the time as a child, and there are various legends and they always go around the side of the page, but this one says something like the wolf and the lamb shall dwell with the lamb, and leopard shall lie down with the kid and the calf and the young lion, and they shall be led from the wilderness by a little child. There's a little child. Here are the wild animals, and the child, the innocent, is leading the savages from the wilderness. But down here, there is a man in a tricorn hat, one of the Pilgrim Fathers, has his hands towards 3 First Nation American Indians who have all feathered up, and in this manner, the European is actually negotiating for the land. Now, as a kid, I completely missed this detail that appears in every one of these paintings. This is the preparation for those people, the psychological preparation for those people to lose their land. And it is explained away as the savage being led out of the wilderness to see the light. This is a relation of mine, Manalajanna. He was forced to help George Augustus Robinson in Tasmania find his people. And he tried all sorts of ways of not finding his people, by seeing the signs of where his people were by smoke or tracks, and he would take George Augustus Robinson, the Great White Hope, in the other direction. This went on for months. Eventually Robinson got sick of it, and they collected together maybe 20 or 30 Aboriginal people, put them on a boat to Great Green Island, and when Manalajanna, one of the great warriors of Tasmania, reached the shore in the bow of that boat, he began to take the dreadlocks, which are pelleted with clay in the traditional way. He would cut those dreadlocks off and cast them into the sea. That was his abdication of his role as the leader of his people. It is the most soul-destroying admission of defeat I've ever read. This is my great uncle. This is a photograph which ought to change your whole perception of Australian history. In the Australian Museum, Daylesford Museum, Rockhampton Museum, virtually wherever you go in the country, you'll find these stones. They are all labelled unusual stone, stone of unknown use, because people, Europeans who collected them, and they collected thousands of them, didn't know what they were for. Here's the hafting mark on that stone. A long handle was attached to it at right angles to the stone. The stone itself was that big, too heavy to work above the waist with for any length of time. So the handle was attached to it, and the stone is so heavy, the handle so long, the only way you could use it is like that. Jonathan Jones, a Sydney artist, examined all of these stones and examined this part of the stone to find out what it had been used for, and it had only been used in soil. This is an extraordinary photograph. These are Aboriginal picks, and in fact this legend here says that this is a bogan pick from the Bogan River on the Queensland-New South Wales border. This changes Australian history, because Aboriginal people were said to be hunters and gatherers. What are hunters and gatherers doing turning the soil? Lieutenant Gray in Western Australia came across a field of yam that stretched to the horizon, and it had been so deeply tilled that he couldn't walk across it. Why aren't we telling Australian students about this incredible devotion of labour to food production? Who was the first history teacher, the first history lecturer, the first curriculum designer who decided that this wasn't interesting for Australian students? When I went to university, I was told, when I asked to do Australian history, look, we don't do Australian history because nothing has happened. And what their meaning is, there was no Guy Fawkes in Australia. There were no beheadings. No prince went up into the tower and was incarcerated there. Nothing happened in 200 years. But plenty happened in 80,000 years.